Okay, welcome people to week 11 of our Exploring the Old Testament course. And tonight we're going to be looking at, under the title, From Judges to Justice, looking at kings and prophets in ancient Israel. And we'll have a particular focus in the middle on the book of Ruth, small little book. So, From Judges to Justice. Using the photos as a bit of a prompt, who are some of the key figures that you might think of in this period?
Sheet.
Samuel.
Daniel?
Elijah, Elisha,
David.
Zechariah.
Solomon.
Yeah. Any thoughts?
Joshua in the middle, Judge, that looks like Moses in the middle, actually.
It does a bit look a bit like Moses. I think it's supposed to be Elijah.
Elijah.
Right.
Any thoughts about the female figure in the top left?
Deborah?
Deborah. Oh, yes. Famous female judge.
What would we do without Derek to know these things? He goes, everyone in the morning group goes, duh. Derek's there, right on the money, right away.
So you remember in the early part of this course, we focused a great deal of attention on the Pentateuch, the Torah, books from Genesis through to Deuteronomy. And we looked at the primeval stories and then the ancestral stories, the book of Exodus telling about the time in Egypt and the release from slavery in Egypt, freedom through the Exodus, the teachings of the law that were given as the people wandered in the wilderness, and then further accounts of that in Leviticus and Numbers, and a looking back, a remembering of that in the book of Deuteronomy. So following on from the Pentateuch, there's a series of books which are often called the Deuteronomistic history. And the little bit of this information is on page 93 of your books. The stories in the Deuteronomistic history come from long ago, from the formation of Israel, the glory days that it experienced as a unified kingdom, the time when it was split into two kingdoms, and then the decline and exile of first the north and then the south kingdom. So it spans from about 1250 to about 587, a long, long period of time. It's probably likely, as like we've seen in some of the other history narrative books, that there are old oral traditions that are included. But there are also references made to some written works, some books that we no longer have, but obviously were in existence when the Deuteronomistic history was being compiled. A reference to the books of the War of the Lord in Numbers, the book of the Acts of Solomon in First Kings, the book of the Annals of the Kings of Israel, and the book of the Annals of the Kings of Judah in First and Second Kings. In the form that we have the Deuteronomistic history, that series of narrative history type books running from Joshua through to Second Kings, in that form, it's believed that it was collected together as a unified literary work after the exile. And it was the priests that were overseeing the reconstruction of the city and the people that also constructed or reconstructed the stories of Israel into this cohesive narrative whole. So after the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, we've got the story of Joshua taking possession of a land through a series of violent invasions. And then the book of Judges telling about the settlement in the land and consolidation, although Judges itself makes it quite clear that this was a period of quite some disobedience and chaos. And Judges spans a number of centuries. It covers quite a lot of time. Of course, the story of the conquest and the settlement of Canaan is told in Joshua and a little bit in Judges, in basically as a military style invasion and a conquest of the whole of the land. That's the way the Bible portrays it. But the archaeological evidence does not seem to fit very well at all with what is told in the Bible. We're not going to spend a session on that now. We've done a lot about historical analysis of other parts of the Bible. We can come back to this at another point in another course, but just noting that, so there are some other theories about the conquest, the invasion, the settlement in the land. Alongside the military invasion, which is how the Bible portrays it, there is a theory that there was a peaceful immigration of outsiders who had already had earlier contact with Israel, and that as they were assimilated into the country, new elements were introduced and it started to change from Canaan to Israel. There's a third theory that has been proposed, and that is that since there's very little evidence about people coming from outside, i.e. Egypt, into the land, that perhaps it may have been through social uprising of diverse groups of people, mostly indigenous people who had been there but probably were in a fairly oppressed situation, and they formed coalitions and incorporated diverse traditions as they rose and took power. So they're the theories about the conquest, which sit alongside of the biblical narrative. Of course, one thing that the Bible does in Numbers, it tells us about the counting of all of the tribes and the setting out of where all of those tribes will be in the land. And that's all linked back to the story in Genesis, the latter part of Genesis, about the 12 sons of Jacob. So each of those 12 sons is given an approximate, an area of land in what becomes the land of Israel. And that map on the right is the way in which the map is drawn, taking into account what's said in Numbers and what's said in the Joshua Judges accounts. So that's like the ideal about what Israel might have looked like when people were settled in the land. Now we're actually going to dip into a story that's set at that time before we go on and look at the latter part of the Deuteronomistic history. It's the story of Ruth, a most remarkable woman. Ruth, as you may recall, is one of the books, it's only a short book of 4 chapters. It's one of the books that are included in the writings in the Hebrew Bible, the 3rd section of the Old Testament. But we find in Christian scripture that it is placed in the midst of this narrative stream, the so-called Deuteronomistic history. And it is actually told in narrative style. It's a story. And it's told in the style of the history books, and it's placed immediately after Judges, which is where it fits in terms of the story. The story is set in the time when Israel had settled in the land, and it's set before there were kings in Israel. And of course, the book of Ruth ends by pointing out that Ruth was an ancestor of David, who becomes the great king in Israel. So whilst that's where the story is set, the consensus of scholarly opinion is the book was actually written after the exile, when the people had returned to the land of Israel, and when a particular issue of relationship between Israelites and foreigners was to the fore. So Elizabeth's going to take us through a journey through the 4 chapters of Ruth, and to do that you will need the text of Ruth in front of you. So if you can open it up on your phone or device, or even the old paper version, that would be good.
I've got an old paper version. You can see far more of the text at once. So I recommend the old paper version for the book of Ruth. So as John said, it's thought that this book is not set when the judges ruled, but somewhere in the 5th century BCE, when the issue of purity of Israel came up with Ezra and Nehemiah on the return to the land, and the attitude towards foreigners turned decidedly nasty, and it was decreed that Israelite men that had married foreign women should divorce them. There was a bit of a split between the northern and southern kingdom over this. And this book seems to have picked up some of that, in some ways the way the book of Job picked up the prosperity kind of reward and punishment system of Deuteronomy. The author of the book of Ruth, also considered a wisdom book, is challenging that from this time. So there's just a little bit of background that we'll put up with some slides to understand a few things about this particular book before we plunge into it. So this is the first one we're going to note before we look at the text. No Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of their descendants shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord, because they did not meet you with food and water on your journey out of Egypt. And they hired Balaam against you, and they did all sorts of nasty things that we don't like. So you shall never promote their welfare or their prosperity as long as you live. Now, if you've looked at the book of Ruth, you'd realise one thing about Ruth: she's a Moabite. And it's hard to miss this because the author of Ruth reminds you of this fact constantly. But before I start talking about Ruth, I thought I'd ask you what you think about Ruth. What do you think this book's about? What do you think what are the general impressions that you have about the book of Ruth? And what do you think the points are the author wants to make, apart from that very obvious one we've just pointed out?
I'd say it's about someone who's willing to give up their comfort zone in order to, I guess, serve her mother-in-law,
Okay.
which is pretty incredible considering all the fables about mother-in-laws.
Yes. Korean mother-in-laws love this story. Korean daughter-in-laws don't like it very much.
I can understand that.
Any other comments?
But I definitely think it's about someone moving out of their comfort zone for love.
Okay.
But it's also about someone who's willing, was willing to share or to get out of the comfort zone to walk with her mother-in-law.
Yeah.
I think it's also a story that pretty much points out to people, well, maybe there is some integration possible. Ruth is a Moabite. She's chosen to serve the Lord. She's chosen to stick with her mother-in-law, and I don't think the mother-in-law was very much in favor of that. So I don't think it's necessarily all about serving Naomi. That Ruth, and that's okay. You can cope with people that come from a foreign land, but they can become part of Israel.
Yes, so it's a lesson about foreigners, particularly ones that you're ordered not to look out for their welfare. Because, of course, this whole book, everyone's eventually looking out for Ruth's welfare. It ends up that way.
It also seems to be a story about faithfulness and fidelity. Ruth and Orpah's faithfulness to Naomi, and subsequently, Boaz doing the right thing, faithfulness to family. So it's sort of setting an example for Israelite values and social norms and familial values.
Well, I'm going to ask you a question about this. I'm going to pop around a bit on the first chapter. Who is the obedient daughter-in-law?
The one that turned back.
That's right. It's Orpah. Is Ruth obedient?
No.
No, she's not. And when Naomi says, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods, return after your sister-in-law, Ruth gives this rather over-the-top speech, given the circumstances, that we like very much, but may not emulate ourselves, I suspect. And then what happens in verse 18? Is Naomi grateful?
No, she just gave up.
Yep, she just gave up. When Naomi saw Ruth was determined to go, she said no more. How do you reckon a widowed Israelite woman is going to going back home with a Moabite in tow?
Not very well.
And to face
Possibly
lots
not.
of opposition.
Possibly not, that's right, because we have this injunction I've just showed you about Deuteronomy that says you're not going to be nice to Moabites. And here is a Moabite persisting in the face of opposition in going with her mother-in-law. And while we might think that's a great idea, it's probably not Naomi's probably not feeling the love at this point in time. The other thing about Ruth is, has anyone ever found this a funny book?
What, laugh funny
Yeah.
or peculiar?
No, laugh out loud.
No, I can't say that it has crossed my mind to laugh out loud, Anthony.
Okay, then we need to talk about how Ruth opens as a book, because it's a comedic drama.
Oh, really?
What is funny about Ruth? Well, let's start with the beginning of it. In the day when the judges ruled, that's the book that's just come before this, there was a famine in the land, and it's a famine in Bethlehem. Anyone know what Bethlehem actually means in Hebrew? House of bread. So there's a famine in the house of bread. And so they're forced to go and live in Moab, where they're not supposed to be. And they get bread from Moab, who are the country that refused bread to Israel. Can you see that we're setting up a certain comedic routine here? Yes, we are. And we have a man named Elimelech. That means God is king. So he's a good, faithful kind of Jew. And he's got his wife Naomi, Naomi means sweet. And that becomes significant at the end of the chapter. And the names of his two sons, it says, are Mahlon and Chilion. Mahlon and Chilion in Hebrew mean consumption and sickness. Exactly. You laugh out loud. So the house of bread has no bread, and the land of Moab, who wouldn't give bread, is now giving bread. And the sons of this couple going there are consumption and sickness. Have we set up, you think, a comedic drama? Yes, we do. We have.
It's interesting that when the Israelites first asked for bread, Moab would have had bread.
Oh, that's right. Anyway, they're in Moab, which would be under Israelite law. This is probably the last place you would go. So anyway, they've trotted off to Moab. Consumption and sickness have gone to Moab, and they've taken two wives there, Orpah and Naomi. But then Elimelech, God is king, dies, and Naomi is left with her two sons who've taken these Moabite wives, Orpah, and the other is Ruth. And they lived there in 10 years. And of course, consumption and sickness die, as one would expect. If you are named consumption and sickness in a story, there's a good odds are on you're not going to have a long and healthy life. So poor old Naomi is left without her two sons and her husband. So that's the setting. That's how we're setting up this book. This is not meant to be taken completely seriously. It's funny, and it's meant to be funny. And if you don't have it translated really well, you're not going to get the joke. So there's some unusual things that follow, because when Naomi says to her daughters, go back, each of you, to your mother's house, that's a very unusual statement. Normally it would be your father's house. So is there a suggestion here that both daughters-in-law have widowed mothers, in which case they might be quite poor? I don't know, but it's quite unusual. And she blesses them. May the Lord deal kindly with them. And they want to return with her, and she says, go back. And as I said, Orpah is the obedient one. But then we have a reference here to a particular law, again, another law we have in Israel. In verse 12, it says, turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and bore sons, would you wait until they're grown up? This is a reference to a particular law. Can anyone remember its name before John whacks it up on the PowerPoint?
Or that you take your brother's widow.
Yes, it's the Levirate law. That's what it's called, and you're quite right. And here we have it up here. It's from Deuteronomy 25. If a brother dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family, but instead the brother of the deceased brother will perform this duty for her, and the firstborn whom she bears will have the name of the deceased brother, and he will not be blotted out, and he will inherit any property or anything. And if you don't want to take your widow's brother, then you have the right to go and shame him utterly before everyone at the gate. I don't know what that's going to achieve for you, but yeah, you get to do that. And the elders of the town will summon him, and you can see there's pulling off of sandals. We're going to we'll meet this later. And they're spitting in faces. And this is what is done to a man who does not build up his brother's house. So this is the Levirate law of Deuteronomy. And that is what Naomi's referring to, because she's saying, are you going to hang around with me and wait until I produce a brother to your dead husbands that can then perform this duty? Because even if I produce a husband tonight and have a conceived straight away, you're going to be waiting at least 14 years before this child's good for anything, as it were. So she's talking about this and she's saying there's no point hanging around with me. So Orpah leaves at this point, but Ruth clings to her. Now, Ruth is making some very serious statements in here. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people. Your God, my people. Where you die, I will die and I will be buried there. It is quite over the top. It's not the kind of thing you would expect her to be saying necessarily. And it's a bit unusual in some ways, given that Naomi is a bit reluctant to take her with her back to the house of bread, which apparently has bread again. So we come back to Bethlehem, and the town is stirred up, and the women said, is this Naomi? And she says, call me no longer Naomi, call me Mara. Now, Mara is bitterness. So it's the opposite of sweet, which is what Naomi means. The Lord has dealt bitterly there. So does Naomi say, meet my brother, daughter-in-law Ruth? No, she doesn't.
No.
Is Ruth even mentioned here? No. Is Naomi pleased? Is she stopped from being bitter because Ruth's with her?
Not really.
No to all of that. So Naomi is returned with Ruth, the Moabite, in case you'd missed the point, her daughter-in-law, and come back from the country of Moab. And they came back at the beginning of the barley harvest. So chapter 1, as I'm suggesting to you, is not quite what it seems. And it's setting up some particular things that is important if we're going to think about what's happening. So let's move into the household of Naomi. Now, we have mention of a kinsman here. He's a prominent rich man in the family of Elimelech, and his name's Boaz, and Boaz means pillar of society. Yes, it's meant to be funny. So she has a prominent rich kinsman called Pillar of Society, and Ruth the Moabite, in case you'd missed the point, says to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain behind someone in whose sight I might find favour. What does that mean, do you think?
She's going to pick up a husband.
She's going to pick up a husband. Yes, that's probably bang on the money, Dorothea. That's what she's looking for. I will find favour in someone's sight. So Naomi says, go, my daughter. Does Naomi give her instructions about Israelite law and gleaning?
No.
Does Naomi direct her to
It goes in blind.
Does she say, tell her how to keep safe?
No.
Tell her where Boaz's fields are? No.
No.
No, she doesn't. And so Ruth goes out and comes and gleans in the field behind Reapers, and just by amazing coincidence, as it happened, she lights on the field of Boaz. So we know she hasn't been told beforehand. Verse 3 makes it clear, as it happened. Ruth comes to the part of the field belonging to the pillar of society, who is in the family of God is King. Just then Boaz comes from Bethlehem and says, the Lord be with you. And then he says, who does this young woman belong? So Boaz is what?
Pillar of society.
And interested. He's an interested pillar of society at this point in time. So she is the Moabite, in case you'd missed the point, who came back from Naomi from the country of Moab.
But he's also a relative of Naomi's husband.
Yes.
Is that close enough to being a brother?
Well, good question. Fair and to the point, Jenny, and we'll come to that in the last chapter.
Okay.
Yes, indeed. Yes, he is, if he's the closest one. So she asked to glean among the sheaves, and she's there, and then Boaz goes up to Ruth. There's an exchange, We learn a bit about the sociology here. Keep your eyes on the field being reaped, followed behind. I have ordered the young men not to bother you. That tells us that young men were in the habit of bothering women who were gleaning in the field.
That's very strange.
That is very strange.
Never happened to that, eh?
Maybe not just women, just
Or quite
Moabite
normal.
women.
So she's given permission to drink from the vessels of water that has been drawn, and then she goes a bit over the top again and she falls to her feet, and what does she say? Why have I found favour? There it is again, that phrase, favour in your sight, that you should take notice of me when I'm a foreigner. And Boaz gives this pious little speech about all you've done from your mother-in-law I've heard, and isn't it great, and may the Lord reward you, and you come under his wings, etc. Boaz is the rich pillar of society and nearest kinsman, apparently, at this point. What's he done for Naomi?
Nothing.
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 Nothing. That's right. Nothing. And if you're an Israelite listening to this story, you might well be asking yourself at this point, what is this pompous person who's making these silly speeches in the middle of barley fields done for his mother-in-law? Other than give her this really over-the-top stuff about may the Lord reward you for your great deeds and may you have full reward from the Lord, in case you missed the point there, under whose wings you may have come refuge. And she says again, may I continue to find favour in your sight. That's 3 times that phrase has been used.
But,
And I think Ruth has Boaz's measure at this point, I'm going to venture. And Boaz,
He's grovelling.
along, what does he do? He invites her to eat with him. Come and eat some of this bread, dip your morsel in the wine. So she sits beside the reapers. He heaps her up with parched grain. Boaz is interested. Boaz says to his young men, let her glean even among the standing sheaves, not even at the side, but, you know, where all the juicy grain is. Do not reproach her. In fact, pull out handfuls and leave them in her so she can find them. Yes, it's funny. You're meant to laugh because it's so over the top. Boaz is going out of his way to make sure that she's going to find this mountain of grain. And it's an ephah of barley, which is an enormous mountain. She comes home with it and she shows her mother-in-law. And what does her mother-in-law think straight away?
Interested.
There's a man. That's what
Yeah.
her mother-in-law thinks straight away. There's a man. She would not come home with this ephah of barley had there not. She says, where did you glean? Where have you worked? And blessed be the man who took notice of you. Naomi knows
Yeah.
something's up. And she says, the name of the man I work with today is Boaz. And then Naomi says, blessed be he. There's a lot of blessing by the Lord going on here. Whose kindness has not been forsaken, the living of the dead. And Naomi, and now this is interesting. Whose kindness has not forsaken the living of the dead. Hello, Naomi. Is he looking after you? No.
No.
No, it's meant to be ironic. This
But
man is a
suddenly-
relative of ours, one of our nearest kin. And then Ruth says, he even said to me, stay close to my servants. Now Naomi gives Ruth the advice she needed. Go out with a young woman, otherwise you might be bothered in another field. That should have happened right at the beginning of this chapter. Anyway, so she gleans until the end of the barley and the wheat harvest, and she lives with her mother-in-law all this time, but the harvests are finishing. So what are they going to do?
Getting desperate.
Hatch a plan.
Yeah.
Hatch a plan, that's right. And what sort of plan do you expect women to be hatching who have no other means? What are they going to do?
They're going to compromise Boaz, aren't they?
No, how do you get the man?
Guys, you are quite right, Derek. That is precisely what they're going to do. The harvests have finished and Boaz is still obviously not stumping up any support. So Naomi decides to take matters into her own hands. And I should have showed you, there is some laws about gleaning that John has on a slide that we could look at. I don't know it'll tell you much other than people were allowed to glean. We'll just, so this is about if you drop a sheep and forget it, don't go back. It's for the alien, the orphan and the widow. This is the welfare system of ancient Israel. So when you beat your olive trees, don't take all the olives, etc., etc. So there is a law about gleaning that was known, and it was to keep the poor from starving. Anyway, the harvests have finished. So what are we going to do now? So, Naomi, my daughter, I need to seek some security for you, not me. Oh, no, I am such a selfless old woman. I want to seek your security, so it may be well with you. And here is our kinsman Boaz, who's done nothing for me. That's me saying that. See, he is in the winnowing barley tonight on the threshing floor. Now, before John puts up the next slide, is this significant that he is on a threshing floor?
Yes.
Yes, it is. And why is that? We're about to find out. You'll notice the threshing floor is mentioned 3 times in this, and there's a reason for it. Do not rejoice, O Israel. Do not exult as other nations do, for you have played the whore, departing from your God. You have loved a prostitute's pay on all the threshing floors. So what does that suggest a threshing floor is, apart from a place you thresh?
Oh, no.
Oh, no. Yes,
Oh, no.
indeed.
It's
Nice
a
place to
brothel.
be. That's right. We're not quite up to that one, John. That
Yeah,
will
yeah.
become pertinent in a minute. So here she is saying, Boaz is at the threshing floor.
He's looking
Now
for
wash
something.
and anoint yourself, put on your best clothes and go down to the threshing floor. It's used again. And in verse 6, she goes down to the threshing floor, in case you missed the point. So, what is Ruth doing? Ruth is being told to wash, anoint herself with perfumed oil, because that's what it would have been, and put on her best clothes. What are we looking at here? What is being set up?
A sexual
seduction.
encounter.
Yeah.
Seduction. So that's what's being put up here. So do not make yourself known to the man until he's finished eating and drinking and he's slightly tipsy and very mellow. And then when he lies down, look at where he's lying. Go and uncover his feet. We've met the feet before.
Yeah.
It's a euphemism. Uncover his feet. And he will tell you what to do. I'm sure he will.
Well, we're
And
talking
she
about
said
his
to her-
genitals.
So she goes down to the threshing floor and she does what her mother's instructed. So Boaz is in a contented mood, which probably says he's had a few beers or some wines. And he goes down to lie at the end of his grain heap. And she came stealthily. So she sneaks up, she uncovers his feet and lays down. At midnight, the man was startled. This is an unusual Hebrew word, this word for startled. It's like being startled awake. It's a passive divine. It's like a Monty Python-esque moment where the big finger of God has come down like this and poked Boaz. And up he wakes and he turns over and lo and behold, there's a woman. Who are you? I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next to a king. Now, what is she asking him to do?
Claim her.
Yeah.
Marry her.
Marry her? Now, this is something somebody brought up earlier. I think it might have been Jenny, and I said, but we'd get to that. Was it Jenny?
Ah, yes.
About the Levirate law?
It's the Levirate
Spread your
law.
cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin. What is she asking him to do?
The
To
Levirate
claim her.
law is
Take a
give her
husband's role.
children.
Take care of her.
More than take care of her. Dorothea's
Take a-
right. It's
Give her
about
Take a
children.
husband's role.
It's
Yeah.
about, she's asking him to do the Levirate duty. So let's have a look at what it means to spread your cloak over to someone from no one more other than Yahweh himself. So this is Yahweh talking about Israel in Ezekiel. I passed you is Israel, I is Yahweh. I passed you again and looked on you. You were in an age for love. I spread my cloak over you. I pledged myself to you. Then I bathed you with water and washed off the blood from you. What does all of that mean? What's just happened?
Sex.
It is sex.
Yeah.
And Israel was a virgin, and at the age for love, God spreads my cloak over you. That is a euphemism for intercourse. And then, of course, Israel being a virgin bleeds. That's what was expected. And so then I bathed you with water and washed the blood off you and put you on nice new clothes. And look at that, anointed you with oil. So you can see that seduction and sexual encounters are related to things like water, washing, oil, And spread my cloak over you is very clear from this context. It's a euphemism for intercourse. So Ruth, that obedient daughter-in-law that you were all talking about, Ruth, your servant, says, spread your cloak over me, for you are next of kin. She's asking for the Levirate law to be enacted here. And he comes back with another one of his little pious speeches, but he then brings up this other near kinsman that we haven't heard about before, more closely related than I. And he says, remain with me this night, and we'll see tomorrow if he acts as next of kin, and then if he doesn't, I will act as next of kin for you. Now, what's next of kin in my translation? I don't know what it is in yours. It could be redeemer. It's the Hebrew word goel, and goel means redeemer. So it's about redeeming something like a parcel of land or an inheritance, and the redemption laws of Israel were really very complex. So she lays at his feet until morning, and then off she goes and takes back a whole pile of barley, where Naomi is very eagerly waiting to see how things went. And she told everything the man had done and saying, he gave me 6 measures of barley. She doesn't repeat the entire conversation, does she? About you are next to me, so put your cloak over me. And Naomi says, well, we'll learn what happens. So there you are. Ruth is probably not quite what you might have thought. Everyone manipulates everybody in this story, and Boaz is no exception, and we're going to come to his turn right now. So Boaz, now I might note that in chapter 3, we've been in the female domain. We've been in the domain of seduction and femininity. It's night, it's dark. This is considered the feminine kind of space. Now we're going to move into broad daylight at the city gates into the masculine space, where Boaz is not going to be startled or anything like that. He's going to be totally in control and in command, in the same way Ruth was in control and in command in chapter 3. So Boaz goes up to the gate, and there is the other Goel, the next of kin or the redeemer, of whom Boaz had spoken. Now my translation says, come over, friend, and sit down. I don't know what your translations say, friend or whatever. You might have some different things in there, but it's Poloni Almoni is what the Hebrew is. It's Hebrew rhyming slang for what's his face. Literally, yes, it's funny. You laugh out loud. So Boaz says, you, what's your name? Come over here. And he puts to this other Goel, what's his name, and says, Naomi has come from Moab and she's selling a parcel of land. Have we heard of this land before?
No.
No. Would Naomi be worried about her fortune and future if she had a parcel of land?
No.
Probably not. So where did it come from? Is Boaz making it up? We'll see. So Naomi he's very cunning. He doesn't put Ruth forward with Levirate duty as the number one thing. The number one thing is Naomi has come back from Moab and is selling a parcel of land that belonged to Elimelech. So I thought I'd say to you, and it's say, bide in the presence of those sitting here. That's where contracts were made with the elders at the gate. If you will redeem it, but if you will not, tell me and I will redeem it myself. Poor old Mr. What's-his-face falls into the trap and says, I will redeem it. That's what it says, truly. I will redeem it. Then Boaz says, well, there's a catch. If you require the field from the hand of Naomi, you also get Ruth the Moabite to maintain the dead man's name on his inheritance. And at this place, Mr. What's-his-face went, oops, and says, no, I can't do that without damaging my own inheritance. You take the right of redemption because I can't redeem it. Now, you might be wondering about this. Well, there may be a Mrs. What's-his-face, of course, that could object to a younger wife coming into the household. It's much more likely that if this particular Goel, Mr. What's-his-face, pays money to redeem the land, that is, buy it from Naomi, and takes Ruth on too, if Ruth was to have a child, that child would inherit that land back. under the complex inheritance laws of Israel, which that's what I think Mr. What's-his-face means when he says, I cannot redeem it without damaging my own inheritance. So he would be putting his land at risk. So he says, no, I can't do it. And so Boaz and Mr. What's-his-face make a transaction, they make a contract, they take off a sandal, they give it to each other, and that is when it's considered legally binding. And Boaz, the pillar of society, says, today you are witness that I've acquired from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to sickness and consumption. And I also have acquired Ruth, the Moabite, in case you'd forgotten, the wife of consumption, to be my wife, to maintain the dead man's name and his inheritance. And off he goes on a little speech about the Levirate law. And then he gives them a little lecture about, may the woman who's coming to your house be like Rachel and Leah, who built up the house of Israel. May you produce children, etc., etc. Now, unlike Rachel and Leah, or maybe not Leah, with Rachel and Rebecca and other wives of the patriarchs, what is the word that's missing in all of this?
Simply no love in.
No love. Love has not been mentioned anywhere, has it?
No.
No, it's all been set up about dealing and wheeling and manipulation and seduction and contracts and stuff like that. Even though he evokes the names of the matriarchs, all of whom people fell desperately in love with. That's what the stories tell us. This isn't something we've got here. And then may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Well, if you know the story of Tamar and Judah, that's a funny reference too.
Yeah.
Tamar was the daughter-in-law that dressed up as a prostitute to seduce a father-in-law to get a child under the Levirate laws. And when he was about to burn her at the stake, she went, and revealed that it was actually him that impregnated her, so he had to spare her. So it's interesting that there's a specific reference to this story at this point. And of course, we know that Ruth the Moabite, in case you'd forgotten, is blessed because the Lord made her conceive. This is the only time the Lord appears in this story, in chapter 4, in verse 13. The Lord made her conceive and she bears a son. Of course she's blessed because she'd have a daughter otherwise. And then everyone is willing to bless Ruth now. Blessed is this daughter-in-law, is more to you than 7 sons. That's a pretty big statement.
Yeah.
And then Naomi takes the child and nurses him. Obviously, milk did not dry up back in ancient times, even with older women. She literally nurses him. That's what it says.
Wow.
And he's given, and of course, he is in line of, he's the father of Jesse, who's the father of David. And we know Ruth must be blessed if she's great-grandmother to David. So this is the story of Ruth. And as I said, it is not what it seems. It has a serious purpose. It is about talking about how you treat the alien and how you treat the widow and also how you treat a Moabite. And it was probably told in this comedic form, I'm thinking, to make it more palatable, to make it more approachable and digestible and maybe convincing than if it was a stern lecture. That's what I'm thinking. But what are you thinking?
You're thinking it could be allegorical in the sense of like a way to tell a story as an allegory to get this other message across, which might not have been politically palatable at another time. So they use this structure of a bit like Pilgrim's Progress in a way.
I think it's much funnier than Pilgrim's Progress, which I find mind-numbingly boring, but that's just me.
I was thinking of the allegorical nature.
Yeah, possibly, but the fact she's claimed as the real great-grandmother of King David suggests that there's an element people want to put in of history. So I'm not sure it is an allegory. I'm not sure what it is. It's certainly a story and it's certainly a narrative and it's certainly got some very funny things in it. If you understand Israelite society in Hebrew, you can see these things that are in it. It's a curious book, but it's a very clever book.
The thing that comes through, I think, is that Ruth has attracted the attention of both the man she married originally and Boaz, so she must have been a fairly good-looking lass.
Probably.
Yeah.
I think that's a reasonable assumption, Derek, because Boaz, the minute he sights her,
Yeah, who's this
Now, she-
woman? You know, who's
that's
this
right.
girl?
She's been there 30 seconds and he's on a case straight away.
Yeah.
And when he finds he's got a right to be on a case, he's ecstatic and he just showers her with gifts and other stuff, which says something about Boaz and nothing. It's not good. And he's warning off the young man probably because he thinks as an old man, he's going to move in on her. He thanks her for that. He does. He thanks her in the threshing floor. He says, thank you for, paying attention to me instead of the young ones, which says there's a bit of an age differential there between the pair of them.
But where did he conjure up the land from? I mean, I don't
Good
get that.
question. Fair and to the point. I think he just made it up because there's no mention of such land, and Naomi certainly does not refer to any such land. And when she finds herself in want, she does not set about selling such land. And of course, there's the little matter of the second redeemer who doesn't help Naomi either. So there's these two close relatives that aren't helping their older relative that is left with nothing. So I reckon this could be the only book in the Bible written by a woman, because women actually save the day in this. They do it within the constraints of their society, which is patriarchal, but within those constraints, you've got to admire the pair of them.
Elizabeth.
But it's not necessarily a story about obedience. No one is being obedient in this story. No one is following any laws or directions in this story. They're all highly manipulative. And they make stuff
On the
up.
other hand, the thing we talked about coincidences. There are no such thing in my book as coincidences. She didn't know she was gleaning in Boaz's field. Well, not according to the story.
Well, no, not according to the story. And of course, it's not meant to be seen as a coincidence. You're quite right, Derek. I mean, it's all being set up. But as I said, the Lord only enters at once, and that's when he causes her to fall pregnant.
True,
with the
but
son.
the book of Esther doesn't mention the Lord at all. So
No, that's right. That's exactly right. So any more comments or questions about Ruth? Ruth is actually a funny story. It is meant to have humour in it. John?
Yeah, I'm sorry I missed so much of the course, and this is the reason why I'm asking the question. My understanding is that Ruth was written 500 years before the Joshua part of the story, that Ruth goes right back to the 9th century, according to page 21.
No, that's when it's set.
Well,
think.
is that what it's set, or that's not what it's saying there?
No, it's
That Ruth
set.
is about the night, when it was written.
Yes.
What was written when? Anyhow, I've had a bit of a homework on it. It does seem to be an outlier in that sense, and pre-Pentateuch.
And she's been written into history.
Well, she has. But on page 99, it says Ruth is set in the days when the judges ruled, which is around that time, but it's probably written in the 5th century.
Well, it's older than that. Yeah.
Maybe. I don't know.
But my other
with all
question
of these
is,
books,
what
none
do
of them
we
are
learn out of
dated.
it? What's the learning in terms of the nature or experience of God or anything?
Well, that's a good question. And maybe it is that we want to take this book far more seriously than we're intended to take it. I would say the overall learning out of it is that the house of Bethlehem can run out of bread. The house of bread can run out of bed, and that Moabites can be decent people.
Yeah.
I think that's the main learning out of this. And if scholars are right saying it was written around the time of Nehemiah and Ezra as a kind of antidote or contradiction to the rule to get rid of foreign wives, it makes a lot more sense, I think.
Well, she becomes one of 3 non-Israelites who are in Jesus' descent line.
That's correct. She's in Matthew's genealogy.
Yeah.
That's right.
background. I mean, you know, he stood for the poor and the social outcast, and his great-grandmother was one of them.
Well, David's great-grandmother.
Well, yeah, okay.
There's a few more generations
Yes,
before you're going to get
yes.
to Jesus, Patricia.
I
There's a
agree.
few
I
more
agree.
greats in
No
there.
problem there. But it just seems to me that it's part of this humble man that was born into society that made such a significant impact on the world. And
Yeah,
he
and that's-
represented the very people that he stood for.
And that's why it's in Matthew's genealogy in all probability, or one of the reasons. There's several reasons why her name is mentioned, but that's one of them. But I mean, that's what I think its overarching aim is. It's to persuade you that Moabites and aliens and foreigners are okay. And it's to persuade you also that not all Israelites are necessarily going to behave in a decent way either. It's not that anyone does anything bad, but they are highly manipulative of each other. And that's very clear from this story. So no one comes out of the hero of this, really, in many ways. But, you know that Ruth is blessed because she has this child that becomes the grandfather of David. And that's a pretty big blessing in terms of Old Testament, when we're looking at the Old Testament. So I think that's what we can take out of it. And I've got some questions in your book about how you can relate it to refugees and hospitality in terms of how we think about this. And it's quite subversive to the dominant culture because the women actually take control and they get Boaz. I mean, Boaz really is being pulled along by the nose here in some ways, and he succumbs to this to the point he goes and manipulates poor old what's his name to get what he wants. So it's a very clever book. And it looks as a society where women who might be put down, particularly poor widowed women, they're the heroes of this. They become the champions. They win the day. Naomi suckles the baby. Ruth gives birth to a son. They are really great. You know, they come out of here the heroes.
In a book of a collection of stories, the Old Testament, there aren't all that many heroes.
No, there's not. And these women, even though they do it in a rather strange way, they are a bit like Tamar. She does it through deception as well, and she seduces Judah. They're shown to be justified at the end of it.
No, she said, though, Naomi has certainly changed her mind compared to, when they first got there, and she was not even keen to introduce.
That's right.
Ruth.
She has changed her mind.
She's kind of done a big turnaround.
She has done a turnaround because Naomi finds that Ruth is her conduit to Boaz, the rich kinsman.
Yeah.
She hasn't got another one. He's not doing the right thing.
He's an opportunist.
He is completely opportunistic. And Ruth is that conduit between Naomi and this man to preserve them all from what?
Hunger.
Yeah. Poverty.
That's right. Because you're only, as I said, the social system was gleaning. So once the harvest finished, unless you'd managed to stockpile some, highly unlikely if you were gleaning, you'd only have enough to get by probably most weeks. That's why the amount Boaz gives her is a ridiculous amount for a gleaner. That's not what your average gleaner is taking home. But everything is exaggerated here. The speeches are exaggerated. At the end, when the women say she's worth more than 7 sons, well, I'm sure Naomi would have a private opinion about that. No daughter-in-law is going to be worth more than 7 sons. It just doesn't happen. So there's all this over-the-top stuff in there that we like to take very seriously and say, well, what a wonderful, obedient woman that she is. Well, she's not really. But she's a wonderful woman nonetheless. And this is a really feminist, subversive book for its time.
So that's why it's ironic.
Yes.
To get this secret message across, or the telling of the story in this way, which couldn't be otherwise told.
That's right. That's what I think, Bill.
Yeah.
And it's using those vehicles.
So what would be an interesting exercise for you, Elizabeth, while we're away, is to write a modern retelling of this story.
Oh, yes, I like that idea. Go ahead.
And
it was
Elizabeth is going to
suggested
do
this
this.
morning I should write a play.
Well, not a play, no, not a play.
Oh,
just
that's a good idea.
a short story.
Because if you saw this performed in a Monty Python-esque way, because that would actually give it that colour that it needs, I think, you'd probably see it quite differently than when you just pick it up and read it.
A Life of Brian.
That's a Life of Brian kind of thing. That's absolutely what it is. And we've just missed that. We just missed it. We've made it so serious and we've turned it into this pietistic lesson about faith and obedience and humbleness and serving. And that is not what it's about at all. Where does anyone's faith get mentioned in this? That would be absolutely nowhere.
The Bible I've got here is more of a like a reflective Bible, but it is side notes. It's more about the tenderness of the situation rather than the rawness that was probably going on. So it presents it in a quite soft tone, which is probably not really there.
No, because there's no tenderness that I would spot in here. It's all go and seduce him.
Well, because women were thought of as chattels. You owned them.
That's right. And here are two women who are not owned by men because consumption and sickness have had the nerve to drop dead, as you'd expect them to with those names. And they've thrown utterly on their resources, and they use the resources they have, and they use them exceptionally well.
Yeah.
So, Damien, I hope I haven't completely destroyed your view of the Book of Ruth.
No, not at all. It's more of the underlying irony and so on.
Yeah,
I can't have feeling that Naomi has been very clever. She knows the customs. She knows Boaz. If he finds a woman lying at his feet, he's going to be pretty embarrassed if his workers find her in the morning and so on.
That's right.
I think she's I think she's shown a great deal of acumen there.
Oh, she has. She has. There's no doubt about it, Derek. Though she sends Ruth into potential danger. I mean, the threshing floor is where prostitutes and, adulterous liaisons take place. So Ruth going there the way she does, dressed up to the nines and with her perfumed oil and all washed up, anyone seeing her going there would know that something's afoot. None of it good. And we assume there's no Mrs. Boaz, that he's a widow, he's just not going around to finding a wife, which should be unusual. But, there's no mention of that. And, of course, he falls for it hook, line and sinker, just as Naomi plans it and Ruth beautifully executes it.
So we should move on from this R-rated debauchery, spiritual matters of the text. And Ruth is set in the period of the Judges, and the Deuteronomistic history continues on with 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings, narratives that recount the transition from Judges to Kings. And alongside the Kings are the prophets who mediate God's word to the people, who warn the kings and then the people about the dangers of their worship of other gods. So, of course, the crucial question in the early part of 1 Samuel is, should Israel have a king? If you read chapters 8, 9 and 10 and carefully, we won't be doing that tonight, but if you read them carefully, you will see there are different points of view. It's almost like a classic debate. Other nations have a king. Why should not Israel have a king? This is the case in favour. Yes, but we have God as our king. We don't need a human king. It's the case against. And then back and forth between the pro and the con. Eventually, the prophet Samuel, after negotiating with God, anoints Saul as king. And then Saul is followed by David, who, of course, is the archetypal king. And in order to ground it with where we've been, David, of course, is a descendant of Ruth. So there on the right-hand side are the first 3 kings of what's called the unified kingdom: Saul, David, and Solomon. Solomon being one of the sons of David. And whilst David is the one that gives the name to the family line, the house of David, from which Jesus allegedly comes. It's Solomon who was renowned for his wisdom and his wealth and his power. If you read the accounts in Kings carefully, he was also a very violent and manipulative person, but that's basically what you had to be a king back in the ancient world.
Well, look who he's descended from. I mean,
yeah.
Naomi and Ruth.
Yes, right. Yes. Solomon is remembered in particular, and this is relevant right up to today, because under the expansion that took place under him, is the territory of Israel was of the greatest extent of all its history. Solomon was sovereign over all the kingdoms from Euphrates up there in the north, on the edge of Babylon, to the land, through the land of the Philistines, even to the border down in the southwest, the border of Egypt. Now, one of the significances about this is that today in the Middle East, and you know how contested politics and land is in the Middle East, the really hardline, right-wing, ultra-conservative Jews in Israel say, this is what God blessed us with. This is the land that God gave us from Egypt right up to the Euphrates. And that's what modern day Israel should be. They've got no hope at all of that being the case in reality. But it's this map, this reconstruction of what the biblical text says that drives that. At any rate, Solomon is remembered as a great king. And what happens after a great leader inevitably is that there's division and people can't get on. And sure enough, after Solomon, two of his sons become kings, one in the north and one in the south, Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And this creates what's known as the divided kingdoms. The northern kingdom lasts for another 200 years or so. The southern kingdom, based around Jerusalem, lasts for nearly 350 years. The Assyrians, of course, conquer the northern kingdom. The Babylonians conquer the southern kingdom. So here's the list. You have a list like this on page 92 of your books as a resource. Here's a list up on the screen of the various kings. And alongside of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah, there's also a column that has prophets. And every king had at least one prophet to reckon with. The prophet was the conscience of the king. The prophet spoke God's word to the king and called the king to account for the way in which Israel was being ruled. So there are the prophets Samuel, Nathan, Elijah, Elisha, a clutch of Isaiah, Amos, Hosea, Jonah, Micah, etc. through. So just stepping back and thinking, the Pentateuch and the Deuteronomistic history tells stories from long, long, long ago. The Deuteronomistic history stretching from the Exodus, after the Exodus, entry into the land, right through until the exile of the Southern Kingdom around 587. Contains old oral traditions, but also refers to written works. But in the form that we have it, it was collected together as a unified literary work after the exile by the priests who were overseeing reconstruction of the city and the people. And the priests were also involved in collating together the stories and maybe the pre-existing books of Israel to provide this consistent, coherent story, narrative of the people. Now, just as a footnote, alongside of 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings, we have 1 and 2 Chronicles, which actually retell the events of those books from a much stronger, much more explicit priestly perspective. We're going to be spending some time with the chronicler in 2 weeks' time, but let's just note at this point that what the chronicler does is assess the kings of Israel and Judah as either good or evil. And there are certain kings under which there's a time of revival, and there are good kings, and there are those that did evil in the sight of the Lord. So a very schematic understanding of the time of the kingdoms. Now, of course, what follows after that are the books of the prophets. There's some prophetic activity in the historical narratives like Elijah and Elisha and Samuel and Nathan. But after that, there are various books that are in the names of the prophets where we find oracles of hope and judgment spoken to the people of Israel. And in some cases, some of the prophets are bold enough also to address the nations that are around neighbouring Israel and speaking the word of the Lord to them. Well, once the kings and the people brought about judgment upon themselves by failing to keep the covenant and the people were sent into exile, prophets were speaking, continued to speak through the exile and in the return. And Ezra and Nehemiah, that we'll look at also subsequently, recount the return to Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple and the city. So the vast bulk of the Old Testament is this rolling narrative going from the prehistory and then the ancestral narratives right through to the exile and the return from exile and the restoration of the city. A wonderful saga. Of course, when Jews were sent into exile in Babylonia and Assyria, they also moved around, and not all of the Jews that were in exile returned to the homeland. So it's one important thing is to remember what's called the diaspora, the dispersion of Jews. This map shows you that by the 1st century, all of the eastern part of the Mediterranean had Jewish settlements in that area marked purple. By the late Roman period, it had spread. Jews were to be found across in France and Spain and in North Africa, and then in the late Roman period, even up perhaps in Britain. The captivity by the Assyrians and then by the Babylonians actually started the spread of Jews beyond just the Holy Land. There's a list of prophets you've got alongside of the kings in your book, and this is another listing about pre-exilic prophets of Israel, pre-exilic prophets of Judah, and post-exilic prophets. So you can see that those prophets covered quite a span of time. The prophets reminded the kings that the central idea was the importance of covenant with God. That's what the whole of, remember we looked at covenant in Genesis and in Exodus. Covenant is central to the being of Israel, and to keep the covenant, you need to obey the law. And to obey the law, you need to do those things that are just and right and fair. So doing justice is at the heart of the covenant. And that's the prophetic contribution to the Bible that we're going to start into now, and then we'll be looking at over the next 2 weeks.
So I've got a question for you, and I'm going to pop you into your groups to actually talk about it. And the question was the one that was just up on the board. It's just the one. How would you define justice? So I want you to think about that and talk about that in your groups, which I'm just going to look at and see. Yep, that's right. That's 5 minutes. So how would you define biblical justice? So what do you think biblical justice is about?
We struggled because it's different in the Old Testament to the New Testament.
And what's different about it?
Well, as John was saying, there's a lot more retribution in the Old Testament.
That's a very interesting question that you've raised. Is there more retribution in the Old Testament?
Well, there's more because there's more Old Testament books, but
it's the Deuteronomic theory, isn't it?
Yes, it is the Deuteronomic theory.
Well, put it this way, in the New Testament, Christ wouldn't have us families hunting down those who had murdered their son or whatever, and the only way they could get out of the kinsman's retribution would be to go to one of the towns that offered sanctuary.
Yeah. I'll put it to you another way. So you have retribution in the Old Testament, and Jesus does talk about an eye for an eye and a tooth for tooth. Well, let's talk about God, putting people aside. God punishes the wicked. Well, that's what people hope he's doing. We know from Job he's not doing it. So God punishes the wicked and rewards the good in the Old Testament, yes?
Yeah.
We agree with that. And we think that's retributive and we have a problem with it and we think the New Testament's different. Is that correct?
Yeah.
We
Well,
do. All right. If we read the Gospel of Matthew, and we're aware that in Matthew there's more hell than the rest of the New Testament put together.
Well-
So I'm just taking it as a very good example of this. Does God punish the wicked?
Yes.
Yes, that's right. Derek's
Yes.
spot on the money, except you're not smitten or smoted on the spot like you are in the Old Testament where there's no afterlife. You are condemned to a life,
hell.
an eternal life of fiery torment. Now, you tell me what you think is retributive, bearing that in mind. Do not think people are not punished in the New Testament. They're punished in the afterlife, just not this life.
This life, yeah.
There is punishment and retribution and judgment there.
Jesus talked about hell more than anyone else did.
He certainly does in our New Testament. You're quite right. Even Revelation has less hell than the Gospel of Matthew.
Yeah,
And that's saying something.
If you take
That's got a lot.
Jesus, yes, but Elizabeth, take Jesus Sermon on the Mount. Your justice is whether it is dependent on what value set you're taking as you're running with. That's how justice is dependent on the value sets behind it.
That's
so they
true.
change, as you say. And if
What
you
I'm
take-
saying is, in the Gospel of Matthew, if you do not obey the Sermon on the Mount, you will go to hell. And Jesus makes that abundantly clear.
Well,
Yes, he does. And many,
Well, I
many places.
agree.
Chapter 13 is full of hell. Chapter 25 is full of hell. Jesus says the righteous go to heaven and the unrighteous who didn't do the right thing are going to hell where they will burn with the devil and his angels for all eternity. It says that. Now, whether we think Jesus or said it or not is another point for debate.
Well,
I'm
that's
just
right.
taking this at flat value that the story in the Gospel of Matthew tells you if you do not act in a righteous manner, you will go to hell. And it's very clear about that on many occasions. So when we look at the stories of the Old Testament and the stories of the New Testament, the retribution's happening in both. It's just in a different sphere. So biblical justice, it's the word tzedakah, and it's the Greek word dikaiosune. And they mean the same thing. They can be translated as justice or righteousness. It's much more common to find tzedakah translated as justice than righteous. That's in the Old Testament. It's much more common in our New Testament to find dikaiosune, its Greek counterpart, translated as righteousness rather than justice, which in itself is an interesting thing. Both are actually perfectly legitimate ways of translating those words, and it's up to the translator to decide which one they're going to use. So what are the message of the prophets if we want to distill this down a bit more? Micah 6:8 is a very famous one. He has told you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To do justice, to love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. So what do we understand that justice is in this text?
Fairness.
Fairness?
To do right.
To do right, yes, because you can
Concern for
also say,
widows, orphans, and strangers.
and Moabites, that's right. So
And
it could
Moabites, yeah.
equally read, but to do righteousness. It could equally read that because they're two sides of that one coin, that word. So to do tzedakah is to do justice and righteous, or righteous justice, if you like, and love kindness. And all of those things come into it that you have named. What about Amos? When we get on to Amos, he's got a bit to say, and Amos and Isaiah agree on this one about despising festivals and no delight in assemblies, and I don't want your offerings, and I don't care about your fatted animals. Go away with your songs. I don't want to hear your melodies. But then it says, let justice roll down like waters. Now, justice here is mishpat, which is another Hebrew word, and righteousness, tzedakah, flow like an ever-flowing stream. What do you think that verse, justice in this verse is?
Are those two words, justice and righteousness, the same word in the Hebrew?
No, one is mishpat, and that's the first translation of justice, and the second is tzedakah, which they've
right.
translated as righteousness. And I would say correctly, because if you've got mishpat, you can't say justice and justice. So it's justice and righteousness.
I think it's about not looking at yourself, but looking outwards to others.
Action, yep. Let's move to Isaiah now. If you look on page 95 of your books, and John's got them up, it's there. So again, Isaiah says, I've had enough of burnt offerings and rams and fat of fed beasts. So I don't want your blood of bulls, etc. Learn to do good, seek justice, and here we have it. Rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, and plead for the widow. So it's quite clear there about what that understanding of just or righteous behaviour actually is. And if we go to Isaiah 58, who's third Isaiah, it's a couple of chapters into third Isaiah, we've again got the same sort of thing. Is this not the fast I choose, to loose the bonds of injustice, undo the thongs of the yoke, let the oppressed go free, break every yoke, share your bread with the hungry, bring the homeless poor into your house, cover the naked, and not hide yourself from your own kin.
It's action.
It is action again. And you can see the Gospel of Matthew is actually highly dependent on this, because in chapter 25 with the sheep and the goats, what are the things the sheep do? The righteous do things like give water to the thirsty, they clothe the naked, they share their bread with the hungry, they bring the homeless poor home. They do all of these things pretty much. They visit people in prison. That is listed here. So, and with Ezekiel, if we just do one more and we look at how it's designed, Ezekiel actually is defining justice here. We often think of Sodom as being punished because of the actions of the people there against Lot and the way they behaved. But Ezekiel says she and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, and did not aid the poor and needy. So that was the thing applied there. No, in the morning we would have put you back into rooms again and got you to think about how does this apply to the church today, these particular things. Do we spend too much time worrying about our solemn assemblies and our festivals and not enough worrying about what these actions are saying? Are we in Australia guilty of pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, as Ezekiel would say? I've put some questions in there for you to think about, because if you're preaching on this stuff, these are some of the things that you probably need to confront and wrestle with. Is simply attending a church and having worship an adequate response to God?
That's kind of about taking and not giving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Receiving and not giving. Yeah.
And I've put on page 96 and 97, there's a little article by Paul Metzger on what is biblical justice, which if you haven't read, I urge you to read, because it gives you quite a good and succinct, I think, distillation of what biblical justice is and how it could be and probably should be defined. So that's a bit of a race through biblical justice, but understanding something of biblical justice is important when we come to the prophets, because this is what the prophets are on about. He defended the cause of the poor and needy, and so it all went well. Is this not what it means to know me, declares the Lord? And over 2,000 times, these sort of things are mentioned in our Old Testament and our New Testament. So it's clearly something we would say is close to the heart of God.
When we turn to the New Testament, of course, in Luke's Gospel, the first big public scene of Jesus in the synagogue, he reads from the prophet Isaiah, from the latter part of Isaiah, from Isaiah 61, and he quotes this. Basically, this is his manifesto for mission. So all that the prophets were focused on in the Old Testament are taken up by this figure who I think was also functioning like a prophet, this figure, Jesus of Nazareth. Anointed to bring good news to the poor by the Spirit of God, he's sent to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour, all once again things to be expressed in action. And the fact that Luke highlights that and then carries that through in his gospel is very important for Christian faith. So the prophets are entirely relevant in that. So these are the guys that are major prophets. We're going to launch into them next week and give some consideration to Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. As you can see there, Isaiah itself has 3 major parts, which probably very different periods in Israel's history. Matt Anslow, who was with us a few weeks ago, is coming back next week to lead us in the material on the prophets. You will find in your book from page 103 onwards, there's quite a rich collection of material that's been put together about each of these prophets. We won't possibly get through all of that in the class by any means, but that's there for your future reading and consideration.